Good morning. I hope you have a chance to grab a cup of coffee and join me today for a little bit of a devotional. Well, I'm a day late. Yeah, it's because this week has been a little different and pretty interesting for my family. We had a multiple COVID tests in my family, which meant that once you once you do that, you have to kind of distance yourself from everyone and everything for a time. And so that meant having to pivot several meetings to either going online or being canceled. Our board meeting last night actually went and did it via Zoom. And so I'm very thankful for the people around me who can pivot to make sure that all things go okay, despite not being able to be there in person. I'm pleased to report that coronavirus seems to be not affecting my household officially. Um, Having your schedule interrupted has made me think a lot this week. And quite honestly, we're doing this Bible study, this online Bible study right now about being a good neighbor. And the lesson this week was especially poignant for me. It was a good reminder of some things that I've learned in the last number of years. And I wanted to share those things with you today. Um, when we talk about being a good neighbor, when we explore that concept, or even in some of the sermons that we did in the last series, we read the story of the Good Samaritan multiple times. You know, being a good neighbor is a helpful concept, but it's also one that can get us locked into a certain lane that might not be helpful. When we talk about being a good neighbor, we mean more than just being a good neighbor. So we always explore this parable and suggest that the concept of being a neighbor is actually much bigger than we give it credit for. So it's far beyond just your physical neighbor. Your physical neighbor is included. Whoever lives next door to you, whatever person lives in the apartment down the hall from you, or physically lives in the house next to your house, that's your neighbor. But your neighbor is also the people who don't look like you or sound like you and talk like you. And that's how we normally explore it because it's helpful for us to remember that our neighbor isn't just our neighbor. Um, but it's also helpful for us to maybe drop the term neighbor sometimes because we can get so locked into thinking about who is my neighbor and expanding that to include the globe that we forget that our neighbor is also our brother, our sister, our husband or our wife, it's our coworker, it's our mother or father, it's our children. Our neighbor also encompasses these other relationships as well. And so, what does it mean to be a good friend? What does it mean to be a good brother? What does it mean to be a good husband? Those are things that we also have to consider as we think about being a good neighbor. One of the things in our culture that gets in the way of being a good neighbor is time. Um, we seem to have less and less time, and the only folks who are at fault for that most of the time is us. We pack our schedules out. We just sign up for thing after thing. We make sure that kids have every opportunity they could possibly have, and that's not a bad thing, I guess. That kids have every opportunity that they could have. I think that all parents, even my parents when I was a kid, also tried to make sure we had every opportunity possible. But at some point, wisdom also has to prevail, where we say, look, um, too many opportunities can be a negative thing too. Too much in our schedule, too much to do, too many things to be signed up for. These can be negative things. A few years ago, I had my first senior leadership role in ministry. And it was one of those things that I was really excited about, sort of a dream job. And I wanted to take it very seriously. I wanted to learn as much as possible. And so as soon as I moved into that role, I began to read everything I get my hands on about leadership. I even went to a school in New York City where various high level leaders came in and talked to a cohort class model that kind of moved through the year together. And one of the things that always came up in all these books that I read about all these successful leaders and all of these folks who would come in and talk to these classes is time management. Time management is so essential because we lose so much time during the day. And what I found myself doing was adopting all of these practices to try and carve out as much time as possible. And I needed to make sure that I could do as many projects, that I could meet with as many staff, I could come up with as many concepts, that I could try and tackle as many things on my task list as possible in any given day. That was always the goal. And so one of the things that I did was use a Google Calendar, and Google Calendar is a great thing. And my wife and I have a shared one that we use so that we can coordinate our schedules together, especially with both of us having various meetings at different times throughout the week. But this particular model that I adopted was that, throughout the day, just take a look at your day and all the things you want to accomplish and denote how much time you think those will take. And so if you have a 15-minute project or task, you put that in your calendar for that 15 minutes. So write email to Joe Schmo, and you write down for 10 minutes, and there's a 10-minute block in your schedule. And then what's the next thing you have to do after that? Well, after you do that, then I can go out and I can do this project, and that's going to take me an hour and a half. So I block out an hour and a half in my schedule. And then I got to meet with this person, and so I block out an hour in my schedule. And then I need to drive to this location to pick up this thing, and so I mark off half an hour for the drive, half an hour for the pickup, and a half an hour for the returning. And so what ends up happening is my day becomes just a whole bunch of blocks, and there's no spaces in between any of those blocks, because what I've done is I've taken every minute of my day and I have carved out how much time I think it's going to take to accomplish everything I want to get done. Well, it worked. I was able to do a lot. Was able to accomplish a ton of tasks every day. I felt very organized. But what it did is it didn't leave me a lot of margin in my schedule. At some point, I went to seminary, and while I was in seminary, I was talking to a friend, a person who is now a friend of mine, and he was a pastor in Canada, and he was sharing with me how he absolutely doesn't do what I do with his schedule. In fact, he builds margin into his schedule. Rather than packing out every minute of the whole day and trying to get as many tasks done, he picks a number of tasks that he can get done in the allotted day that he has, but he leaves space at the end of the day. So if somebody shows up unexpectedly, if something goes wrong, or if a new task suddenly needs to be added, if there's a family emergency, then he has margin built into his day so that those things can still happen. There was a lot of wisdom in that and a lot of health in that, because when I heard that from him, I was at the point of near burnout, of having run and run and run and run so fast and so hard and not giving myself any margin. And I didn't give my family margin. I just worked as much as I could for as long as I could. And I didn't build the margin in for them to show up in the middle of my life. And certainly not for staff members who I cared a lot about, who I wanted to care for as much as possible. It's hard to just show up at my door and talk to me. I needed you to schedule some time with me a day or two out. Or at the very, very earliest, you could maybe catch me in the morning and say, "Do you have time this afternoon?" And I could work it into my schedule. Um, those things aren't necessarily bad. And I don't want, like, if you're a person that's the way your schedule's working right now, I'm not trying to make you feel bad about your schedule. What I want to warn you is, if you don't have margin built into your schedule, it's really hard to be a good neighbor. If you don't have margin built into your schedule, it's really hard to be a good husband, a good father, a good friend, a good coworker, a good boss, a good employee. Um, because it's in the margins that we find people, we meet people, that we hear their needs, that we're able to listen, and then that beyond listening, we're able to respond. I have a passage I want to read to you this morning from Luke chapter 10, starting at verse 38. It says, "As Jesus and the disciples continued on their way to Jerusalem, they came to a village where a woman named Martha welcomed them into their home. Her sister Mary sat at the Lord's feet listening to what he taught, but Martha was worrying over the big dinner she was preparing. She came to Jesus and said, 'Lord, doesn't it seem unfair to you that my sister just sits here while I do all the work? Tell her to come and help me.' But the Lord said to her, 'My dear Martha, you are so upset over all these details. There is really only one thing worth being concerned about, and Mary has discovered it. I will not take it away from her.'" It's a short story. It's a brief moment. And actually, in Luke, the disciple Luke, he puts this story directly after Jesus tells the parable of the Good Samaritan. And so this idea of being a good neighbor is linked to this idea of, of Mary discovering that there's only one thing worth being concerned about. And in this passage, it seems to give us the idea that that one thing that's worth being concerned about is sitting at the feet of Jesus. It's responding to Jesus' call. And if Jesus enters into your home, what's your response going to be? To go around and work yourself to the bones in order to make sure your house is really clean and picked up? Or are you just going to sit at Jesus' feet and listen to what he says? You're going to respond to what he says. And see, the thing is, we all have this call in our lives. And so the series that we're in right now, Follow, as a church, we are trying to say, what does it look like if we live lives where we actually took this scripture stuff, this Bible, if we took this thing seriously, what might our lives look like? And so if you were to take this teaching seriously, this idea that margin being built into your life is important, that not going constantly one thing after another, of not taking every single thing that you can sign up for and signing up for it, uh, what would it look like if your life had a little bit more breathing room? The coronavirus forced all of us to have a little bit more breathing room, for the most part, all of us. It slowed down. It made us catch our breath. It made us go, man, there's a different way to live than the way we've been living before. And as the world began to open up, as restrictions were lifted and we began to go back into the world, it's like we tried to catch up for all the ground we lost. Maybe that's maybe that's not the smartest thing. Maybe there's a breath to be taken, a time to breathe out and a time to breathe in. And maybe right now the time is for us to breathe in and really consider what might it look like if we built margin into our days, into our schedules, into the schedules of our family, so that when Jesus came knocking and Jesus came to our home, we actually could sit down and respond. What might it look like for your life today for you to respond to what Jesus is calling you? How might your life look different if you took Scripture seriously? And if you had the margin in your schedule to take it seriously? Because for all the desires that we have to follow Jesus and to really follow what he says that we should do, if your schedule is so jam packed that you can't, there's a problem. That's something that we can call idolatry, when we put something ahead of our relationship with Jesus. And in our culture and in our world, there's a good chance that that's busyness, that that's schedule, that that's time management, that that's the next meeting, the next task, the next thing to do. So this morning, I just want to challenge you. What's your schedule look like? Is there time for Jesus? Is there time for you to sit at his feet? And if you had Jesus show up in your house, would he look at you and say, Martha, you're so upset over the details? Or would he look at you and say, Mary, you have discovered the one thing that is worth being concerned about, and I will not take it away from you. I hope you have a great day, guys.